Here's a question from Lauren. My husband, who's a new Christian, asked, why didn't Jesus come to a Chinese family or African or any other nationality? Why specifically the Jews? And how did those other nationalities arrive through a white Jewish survivor called Noah? Were any of the survivors black or Chinese or as distinguishable as they are today?
Well, this is it's a fair question, but it's an odd one, okay? We do not know what color Noah was. There's no indication anywhere that that's the case.
And he wasn't Jewish because there were no
Jews then, right? Now, the question of where all of these different races come from, and I know there's controversy about whether there is such a thing as race, but people who say there is no such thing as race use the concept all the time, it seems like. If there's no such thing as race, you can't be a racist, for example. But in any event, there does seem to be groupings of people, and a lot of this has to do with isolation in geographic areas, and by reproduction, you certain genetic traits become predominant, and so that whole, over time, that whole group of people take on a very particular way of looking of physical appearance. And if you think about in Genesis 11, you have the people being confused with the different languages. This isolates people in different groups already. So you can talk to geneticists about that, but I don't think there's any mystery about that. By the way, this is the case even without God. Even with original, whoever the original humans were, they were one thing, and then you have, over time, through genetic pooling and stuff like that, you have these variations. So this is a question that either side could ask, all right? So it isn't like you had, the Swedes all developing through evolutionary process on their own, and then you have a whole other group of people, developing through the evolutionary process, completely separate. No, there was a core group that ended up moving out, and then they developed these distinctive characteristics. Mm-hmm. That's not an issue I don't see why that's an issue. Here's the other thing that's interesting. Let's just say that, and by the way, there's a theological answer to that. I'll get to that in a moment. But let's just say that Jesus was born of a Chinese family. Wouldn't the same question apply there? Why was he born of a Chinese family and not of a Jewish family or a black family or, a Swedish family? Well, because he's got to be born somewhere. If God's going to send a Messiah, he's got to be born somewhere with some group of people. And so you're not going to be able to avoid that fact. The question doesn't help at all. Now, there is a specific answer why he was born to the Jewish race. Is because the Jewish race was started by God for the purpose of bringing the Messiah into the world. And by the way, it wasn't just, okay, here's a bunch of Jewish people, have a baby, he'll be the Messiah. That's, like 4 BC when that happened. There's thousands of years, at least 2,000 years, actually more, of recorded history of God speaking to prepare and develop the circumstances on which the nation of Israel would be the mouthpiece through which this rescuer would be proclaimed because it came from their race. And this is where, if you want to read, you can look at the story of reality, but it doesn't go into much detail at this point. This is where the Bible Fast Forward, the 8-session series, 50 minutes each with a 150-page workbook that comes with it, syllabus, is going to help, and people will see. There's a whole process that's involved for God preparing the mouthpiece, the people, and all kinds of details for the arrival of the Messiah who would rescue the world, a blessing to all nations according to Genesis 12 and the first 3 verses. That's the promise to Abraham. The ultimate goal of the Abrahamic covenant is to rescue the world. So there is a theological reason why it came through the Jews. God purpose to set aside one person and build from that Abraham, from that one person, a great nation through whom he would reach the world. That's God's purpose. And of course, from that nation came the Messiah, who would be the one who saves the world, but the mouthpiece were the Jews. And they were supposed to be. Ironically, even Dennis Prager, the Jewish talk show host and intellectual, not a Christian, though he's very Christian-friendly, obviously, says the same thing. This was the Jews' job. To bring, well, he would characterize it as ethical monotheism to the world, but the point is God commissioned the Jews to accomplish the spiritual salvation of the world, even on his way of thinking about it. His understanding of spiritual salvation of the world is a little different, but notice we agree on the same thing. He understands God commissions the Jews for that purpose. This is God's great rescue plan for the world.
Yeah, I think the mistake is, especially for a new Christian who may not understand what the Bible's about, they might think Jesus just plopped into the middle of this story that had nothing to do with him, but it's all leading up to him.
Right.
And God chose Abraham, and he talks a lot about how he didn't choose the Jews because they were greater than everyone and more numerous and better and all that. He chose them because he wanted to reveal his glory, his power, his grace. And so he chose one person. And out of one person, Abraham, who, like I said, was after Noah. Noah comes before Abraham. He builds up this entire culture. He gives them the law. He gives them the promises. He gives them the temple. He creates this whole culture where they understand the need for holiness and the need for a sacrifice in order to be holy so that they can be with God. They come to understand sin and what sin is and what things are sin. And this takes so much time. He's building up an entire culture so that when Jesus came, they would recognize him and he would make sense, not just as something out of the blue, but something that was actually the result of all of the things he had set up over the last, 1,500 years or 2,000 years since Abraham.
Just take a moment and read the birth narratives. So that would be in Matthew and that would be in Luke. And then look at the particular things, especially in Luke. Look at the particular things. Well, Matthew starts out with a genealogy. It goes all the way back, to David, I think. I think the Lucan genealogy might go back to Adam. But nevertheless, it's like, why the genealogies in either case? Because there was a promise about a Savior that would come from the line of David. And in both genealogies, we see the line going back in two different directions back to David through two different sons. And it converges. Mary and Joseph are on two different lines from David. And so that in itself, but you look at the birth narratives and you'll see everything that's being said by the angel to Gabriel, by to Zacharias by the angel regarding John the Baptist, the things that are said when they bring Jesus to the temple to be circumcised, all and dedicated, all of the things that the different people are saying, the particulars of what they're saying are tying back into the thread that goes all the way back to Abraham and continues on. They're making reference, they're tying it all to the past. Yes, this is the one, the Savior, promise to our fathers, right? And the promise of Abraham and the Savior, it's all in there. Just read them and just isolate. You can isolate what are the claims being made by all these people that pertain to the history leading up to the coming of Jesus. And you will see the appeal to the continuity of history that has its culmination in the person of Jesus of Nazareth.
And of course, we're talking about Abraham because he's asking about the Jews specifically. But of course, this goes back to Adam and Eve because God promised way back in the garden that there would be a Messiah. And the snake would, how does it go? He
will bruise his heel. He will be bruised on his heel. But he would strike the snake on his head, right?
So the promise goes all the way back to then, but then of course the Jews start with Abraham. So that's why we're focusing on that here.
Right.
But of course, the whole story of the Bible is all connected. It's all one story.